The high country of Colorado does not care about your plans or your prayers. Up there, where the air thins out and the granite peaks scrape the underbelly of the sky, the world operates on a different set of rules. I have spent decades staring at topographical maps until my eyes bled, trying to find the logic in the places where people simply cease to exist. It is a weary business documenting the points where the known world ends and something else begins. You look at the jagged edges of Rocky Mountain National Park and you see beauty, but I see a massive hungry machine that occasionally reaches out and plucks a soul from the trail. It is never a fair fight. The story of Bobby Bizup is one of those files that sits on my desk like a lead weight, refusing to be moved or forgotten. It was the middle of August in 1958, a time when the world felt a little more certain, a little more solid. Bobby was 10 years old, a kid who had already been dealt a difficult hand by life. He was partially deaf, wearing a bulky hearing aid of the era, and his vision was poor enough that he required thick glasses to navigate the world. He was not a mountain climber or a survivalist. He was just a boy at summer camp looking for a bit of adventure in the shadows of Mount Meeker. Camp Saint Malo was the setting, a place of stone and spirit nestled at the base of the Great Divide. The air there smells of sun-warmed pine needles and the cold metallic scent of snowmelt. On that Friday afternoon, the sun was casting long, slanted shadows through the timber, the kind of light that makes the woods look golden and deceptive. Bobby was out with a group fishing in a small creek that meandered near the lodge. It was supposed to be a safe, controlled environment. The counselors were there, the other boys were splashing in the water, and the lodge was only a short distance away. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Bobby decided he had enough of the fishing. He told a counselor he was headed back to the lodge, a walk that should have taken him less than 5 minutes on a well-worn path. He turned his back on the creek and started walking. That was the last time any human eye saw Bobby Bizup in the land of the living. He did not wander off into the deep brush, and he did not scream. He simply stepped into the space between two heartbeats and vanished. The silence that followed was not the natural quiet of the woods, but something heavy and unnatural. When the counselors realized Bobby had not arrived at the lodge, the air in the camp shifted instantly from summer lethargy to cold, biting panic. They searched the immediate area, calling his name, their voices echoing off the stone walls of the chapel. You have to understand the geography of Saint Malo. It is surrounded by steep slopes and dense forest, but the path Bobby was on was clear. A boy with poor vision and a hearing aid does not suddenly become a ghost. They looked in the creek, thinking he might have slipped, but the water was shallow and clear. There was no sign of a struggle, no dropped fishing gear, and no footprints leading into the dark timber. By nightfall, the search had grown into a massive operation. Hundreds of volunteers, forest rangers, and even soldiers from Fort Carson arrived to comb the mountainside. They brought in bloodhounds, those long-eared investigators that can find a scent through rain and rock. But the dogs did nothing. They circled the area where Bobby was last seen, whimpering and refusing to pick up a trail. It was as if his scent had been cut off with a knife at the very spot he turned toward the lodge. The investigators stood in the dark with their flashlights, feeling the temperature drop, wondering how a child could leave no trace in a forest that usually holds onto everything. The search continued for 9 days, a grueling stretch of time where the weather turned sour and the hope began to rot. They covered every square inch of the valley, peering under every rock and into every hollow log. They used helicopters to scan the ridges, their blades beating against the thin mountain air. Nothing. No scrap of clothing, no glint of glasses, no sound of a child crying out. It was a total erasure. The authorities eventually had to call it off, leaving Bobby's parents with a hole in their lives that no amount of prayer could fill. The mountains went back to their silent, stony vigil. A full year passed before the mountain decided to give up a piece of the truth, though it was a truth that defied every law of physics and logic. In 1959, a group of hikers were exploring the high slopes of Mount Meeker far above the camp. They were at an elevation of roughly 10,500 feet, a place of treacherous rock slides and stunted trees. There, lying on a desolate patch of granite, they found a small pile of clothing. It was a pair of jeans, a shirt, and a hearing aid. The items were weathered by the sun and the wind, but they were unmistakably Bobby's. The location of the discovery was what sent a chill through the investigators. This spot was more than 2,000 feet higher in elevation than the camp where Bobby had vanished. To get there, a 10-year-old boy with severe physical limitations would have had to hike miles of uphill vertical terrain, navigating through dense brush and over jagged rock fields in total darkness. He would have had to move with the speed and agility of an Olympic athlete to reach that height before the cold claimed him. And yet there were his things neatly deposited on a ridge that he should never have been able to reach. When they searched the area around the clothing, they found a few fragments of bone and his shoes. The shoes were particularly disturbing. They were found in a position that suggested they had not been walked in until they wore out, but rather placed there. There was no sign of an animal attack, no crushed bones, no bloodstains on the fabric. It was as if Bobby had simply been transported to the top of the mountain, stripped of his earthly belongings and discarded. The investigators looked down from that height at the tiny speck of the camp far below and realized that whatever had happened to that boy was not a simple case of getting lost. I have looked at the weather reports from that night in August. It was cold, dropping toward freezing, but there were no massive storms that would have blown a body miles uphill. Even if a predator like a mountain lion had taken him, they do not carry their prey thousands of feet up a mountain and carefully remove their hearing aids. Predators are messy. Nature is messy. This was something else. This was a clean surgical extraction that ignored the physical boundaries of the terrain. Bobby Bizup did not walk to the top of Mount Mika. He was moved there by a force we do not have a name for yet. The hearing aid is the detail that keeps me awake. It was a delicate piece of electronics from 1958, something that a boy who relied on it to hear the world would never voluntarily discard. It was found sitting on the granite, a silent witness to a journey that should have been impossible. I have seen this pattern before in the files. The missing are often found at high elevations near water or in the middle of boulder fields, in places that baffle the search and rescue teams who know the land best. It is as if something is playing a game with us, showing us how easily it can move us around the board. The official report closed the case as death by exposure, a convenient label that hides the terrifying questions underneath. How did he get there? Why were his clothes found in that specific spot? Why did the dogs fail so completely? These are the questions that the authorities do not like to answer because the answers suggest we are not the masters of the wilderness we pretend to be. We build our camps and our chapels and we think we have tamed the peaks. But Bobby Bizup is a reminder that we are only visitors. And sometimes the mountains decide we don't get to leave. The grief of the Bizup family never truly faded. They were left with a few scraps of cloth and a broken hearing aid, a pathetic return for a life full of potential. I think about Bobby often standing on that path near the creek, the sun on his face, feeling the vibration of the water in his good ear. In one moment he was a boy at camp, and in the next he was part of a mystery that has lasted over 60 years. There is no closure in these stories. Only a deeper sense of dread every time I look at a topographical map and see those high, isolated ridges. The shadows in the Rockies are long, and they hide things that defy our understanding of biology and time. We like to think that if we are careful, if we stay on the path, we are safe. But the path is just an illusion of safety. Bobby was on the path. He was within sight of his friends. He was doing everything right. And yet the mountain reached down and took him anyway. It is a cynical way to look at the world, I know, but after you read enough of these reports, you stop believing in coincidences. You start looking at the tree line and wondering what is looking back. There is a coldness that settles in your chest when you realize that the world is much bigger and much stranger than we are taught in school. We are told that there is a reason for everything, but there is no reason for a partially blind boy to be found on a mountain peak he couldn't have climbed. There is only the fact of it. The hard, cold fact of the granite and the wind. We are left to wonder in the dark, trying to make sense of the screams we never heard and the tracks that were never made. The case of Bobby Bizup remains a cornerstone of the unexplained disappearances in our national parks. It fits the profile so perfectly it's chilling. The proximity to water, the suddenness of the event, the impossible location of the remains, and the presence of granite. It is a formula that repeats itself across the decades from the Cascades to the Appalachians. We are tracking a predator that doesn't leave prints, an anomaly that doesn't follow the rules of our reality. And every year, the list of names gets longer, and the answers stay just out of reach. I sit here in the silence of my office, surrounded by the ghosts of the missing, and I wonder who will be next. The mountains are still there, beautiful and indifferent, waiting for the next person to step off the path and into the unknown. Bobby Bizup was not the first, and he certainly was not the last. The file stays open because the truth is still out there, buried somewhere in the rock and the snow of Mount Mika, waiting for someone to find the courage to look at it without blinking. This pattern of impossible movement is seen again in the case of Jaryd Atadero, who vanished in the Poudre Canyon in 1999. Jaryd was only 3 years old when he disappeared from a trail right in front of a group of adults. Years later, his remains and clothing were found high up on a cliff face in a spot that searchers had checked multiple times, a location that a toddler could never have reached on his own. Like Bobby, Jaryd's clothing was found in a state that suggested it had been placed there, and his death remains a haunting enigma that mirrors the Bizup disappearance in its sheer, terrifying impossibility. The mountains do not just take people. They relocate them in ways that remind us how little we truly understand about the wild spaces that surround us. The air in this office smells like dust and forgotten lives. I sit here at 3 in the morning, the yellow glow of my desk lamp spilling over topographic maps that have been folded and unfolded so many times they are tearing at the seams. Outside, the wind is rattling the window pane, a low, mournful sound that reminds me of the way the air hums just before something goes wrong in the high country. I have spent years looking at these files, staring at the grainy black and white photographs of smiling children who never came home. You see the same look in their eyes, a kind of innocence that the world seems eager to swallow whole. Bobby Bizup was one of those children, a boy who lived in a world of soft edges and muffled sounds because of his hearing and vision. He was a boy who needed the world to be kind, but the mountains do not know the meaning of the word. The search for Bobby was not just a rescue mission, it was a descent into a specific kind of madness that only those who have walked the granite slopes of the Rockies truly understand. When a person vanishes without a sound, the forest changes. The green of the pines starts to look like a wall, and the silence becomes something heavy, something that presses against your eardrums until you start to hear things that aren't there. The searchers back in 1958 felt it. They crawled through the underbrush, their knees raw, and their hands stained with the pitch of the trees, calling a name that the wind just threw back at them. They looked in every crevice and under every fallen log, but Bobby was gone as if he had been lifted right out of his boots. There were no broken branches, no disturbed needles, no signs of a struggle that would indicate a predator of flesh and blood had been there. I often think about the dogs. They brought in bloodhounds, animals trained to catch the scent of a human being even days after they have passed through an area. But in these cases, the dogs often do something that chills the blood of the handlers. They reach a certain point on the trail, a spot that looks no different from any other, and they stop. They don't just lose the scent, they refuse to go further. They whine, they tuck their tails, and they look up into the trees or out into the empty air with a terror that is purely primal. It is as if they are sensing a tear in the fabric of the world, a place where the rules of biology and physics have been suspended. In the case of Bobby Bizup, the dogs were useless, wandering in circles while the boy was being moved to a place that defied all logic. Months later, when the snow finally retreated from the high peaks, they found what was left of him. He was found at an elevation of nearly 11,000 feet, resting on a rugged slope of Mount Mika. To get there, a partially blind boy would have had to navigate miles of boulder fields, vertical ascents, and tangled thickets that would challenge an Olympic athlete in peak condition. He would have had to do this in the middle of a storm without shoes, and without making a sound that anyone could hear. The physical impossibility of it is like a weight in my chest. You look at the maps, and you see the distance, you see the gain in altitude, and you realize that Bobby Bizup did not walk to that spot. He was placed there. When the investigators reached the remains, they noticed the details that the official reports always try to gloss over. His clothing was there, but it was arranged in a way that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The shoes were missing a detail that repeats in case after case across the country. Why take the shoes? It is as if whatever is taking these people wants to ensure they can never walk back out of the shadows. The granite beneath him was cold and indifferent. A massive slab of igneous rock that holds onto the heat of the sun but offers no comfort to the living. We talk about the presence of granite in these disappearances as if it were a coincidence, but when you see it on every map in every cluster of cases, you stop believing in accidents. Granite is a conductor, a mineral that vibrates with a frequency we are only beginning to understand. There is a theory whispered in late-night conversations by men who have seen too much that there are places where the earth opens up. Not a physical hole, but a shift in the way we perceive reality. They call it the Oz effect, a sudden crushing silence where the birds stop singing and the wind ceases to blow. It is in that silence that the mountain reaches out. Bobby Bizup stepped into that silence. He was within sight of his friends just a few yards away, and then the world simply blinked, and he was gone. We like to think we are the masters of our environment, that our GPS units and our satellite phones make us safe, but those things are toys compared to the ancient forces that dwell in the deep woods. The more I investigate these files, the more I realize that we are being hunted by something that doesn't follow the laws of nature. It is a predator that moves through the rock, a shadow that doesn't need to leave footprints because it never truly touches the ground. It is an anomaly that looks for the vulnerable, the young, the old, and those who are momentarily separated from the herd. The case of Bobby Bizup is a blueprint for this phenomenon. It has all the hallmarks of a scripted event, a tragedy that was written long before he ever set foot on that trail. The proximity to water, the high elevation, the impossible movement, and the final lonely resting place on a bed of granite. I remember talking to a veteran search and rescue officer who told me about the feeling of being watched in the high country. He said it wasn't like being watched by a mountain lion or a bear. It was the feeling of being watched by the mountain itself. He described a sensation of the air turning thick, like stepping into a pool of cold water, and a low-frequency hum that vibrated in his teeth. He told me that when he felt that, he turned around and walked the other way, and he didn't care who saw him do it. He knew that the mountains have a way of claiming those who don't listen to their instincts. Bobby Bizup didn't have the chance to listen. His world was already quiet, and the mountain just made that quiet permanent. The pattern doesn't stop with Bobby. It stretches across time and geography, linking people who have nothing in common except for the fact that they stepped off the map and into the mouth of the unknown. We see it in the Cascades, where hikers vanish between 2 points on a switchback. We see it in the Great Smoky Mountains, where children disappear from the middle of a group of adults. Each time the searchers find nothing for days or weeks, and then the body appears in a location that has been searched a dozen times before. It is as if they are being returned, dropped back into our reality once they are no longer needed. It is a cynical, terrifying game played by an entity that we cannot see and cannot fight. I sit here and I look at the photograph of Jaryd Atadero, a 3-year-old boy with a bright smile and a head of blonde hair. In 1999, Jaryd was hiking in the Poudre Canyon in Colorado. He was with a group of 11 adults running back and forth between them on the trail. He was never more than a few feet away from someone, and yet in the space of a heartbeat he was gone. They searched for him for years. They used helicopters, thermal imaging, and hundreds of volunteers. They found nothing. It wasn't until 4 years later that 2 hikers stumbled upon his remains. Jaryd was found 550 feet above the trail on a sheer cliff face that required technical climbing gear to reach. His clothing was found first. His little fleece jacket was turned inside out, but it wasn't torn. His shoes were there, but his socks were missing. His skull cap was found tucked into a crevice. How does a 3-year-old boy climb a vertical cliff in the middle of a wilderness? How does he get there without anyone seeing him? The answer is that he doesn't. He was taken, and years later he was put back in a place where he could finally be found, as if the mountain was tired of him. The parallels between Jaryd Atadero and Bobby Bizup are enough to keep you awake at night. Both were in Colorado. Both disappeared in the presence of others. Both were found in impossible locations at high altitudes. Both cases involve the strange state of their clothing and the total absence of a logical explanation. It is the same hand at work, the same invisible force that operates in the shadows of our national parks. We call it a mystery because we are afraid to call it what it really is. It is a harvest. I think about the parents, the ones who spend the rest of their lives looking at the tree line and wondering. They are told that their child must have wandered off, that they must have succumbed to the elements, but they know the truth in their bones. They know that their child didn't just walk away. They know that the forest took them. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with a disappearance like this. It is a wound that never heals, because there is no closure. Only a series of questions that get more disturbing the more you try to answer them. The mountains are beautiful, yes, but they are also a graveyard filled with the people we couldn't save. The hard, cold facts of the granite and the wind are all we have left. We are left to wander in the dark, trying to make sense of the screams we never heard and the tracks that were never made. Bobby Bizup and Jaryd Atadero are just 2 names on a list that is thousands of entries long. Every time I think I have found a logical explanation, I find another case that shatters it. I find another person found on a mountain peak they couldn't have climbed. I find another set of clothes perfectly folded next to a river. I find another dog that refuses to follow a scent into the deep woods. The file on Bobby Bizup stays open on my desk. I find myself looking at the maps of Mount Mika, tracing the lines of the ridges and the valleys, trying to see what the searchers missed. But I know that the answers aren't on the map. The answers are in the spaces between the lines, in the places where the light doesn't reach. We are tracking something that doesn't follow the rules of our reality, an anomaly that views us as nothing more than biological curiosities to be plucked from the trail and discarded on a high peak. As I close the folder tonight, the silence in the office feels heavier than usual. I can almost hear the wind whistling through the pines on the slopes of the Rockies, a cold, thin sound that carries the echoes of the missing. Bobby Bizup was not the first, and he will not be the last. The mountains are still there, waiting for the next person to step off the path and into the unknown. We are told that there is a reason for everything, but as I look at the empty chair across from me, I know that is a lie. There is only the fact of the disappearance, the cold reality of the rock, and the terrifying truth that we are never as safe as we think we are. The pattern of impossible movement and the chilling relocation of remains are not limited to these two cases. In 1938, 5-year-old Alfred Beilhartz disappeared from the Rocky Mountain National Park while hiking with his family. Despite a massive search, no trace of him was ever found until months later when hikers reported seeing a small boy on a high inaccessible ridge that was miles away from where he vanished. Like the others, Alfred was seen in a place he could not have reached on his own, a ghostly figure on the granite skyline. These stories do not end with answers. They only end with the realization that the wilderness is a place of ancient predatory power that we can neither understand nor control. The list of names grows, the patterns repeat, and the mountains continue to keep their secrets buried deep within the stone.